Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the Wild West wasn't a rattlesnake or a loaded gun. Sometimes it was a woman's smile that promised everything and delivered nothing but heartbreak. When Martha Henderson first smiled at drifter Jake Morrison through her kitchen window, he thought he'd found salvation in the middle of nowhere. What he didn't know was that Martha had been waiting 3 long years for someone exactly like him to ride into her life. Someone desperate enough, lonely enough, and foolish enough to believe that a beautiful widow living alone on a remote ranch might actually need rescuing. But Martha Henderson didn't need rescuing. She needed something far more dangerous. She needed a man who would do anything for love, even if it meant walking straight into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. Because sometimes, when grief and loneliness twist a person's heart long enough, even the sweetest smile can hide the darkest intentions. Jake Morrison had been riding for 3 days straight when he first saw the smoke rising from the chimney of the Henderson ranch. His horse, a tired old mare named Bessie, was stumbling more than walking, and Jake's stomach had been eating itself for the better part of 2 days. He'd spent his last dollar on whiskey in the previous town, a mistake that seemed a lot smarter when he was drowning his sorrows than it did now when he was facing the empty prairie with nothing but dust in his pockets. The ranch house sat like a lonely island in an ocean of brown grass, its white-painted walls reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. It was a modest place, not the sprawling mansion of a cattle baron, but it was well maintained. The fence post stood straight, the barn looked solid, and there was a garden behind the house that showed signs of careful tending. More importantly, there was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant food, and possibly work for a man who wasn't too proud to ask for either. Jake had been a drifter for the better part of 5 years, ever since his own ranch had been burned out by raiders and his wife had died of fever during the hard winter that followed. He'd tried to settle down a few times since then, but something always went wrong. Either the work dried up, or he'd get restless, or he'd drink too much and wear out his welcome. The truth was, he'd gotten comfortable with being uncomfortable, with never staying anywhere long enough to care about leaving. As he rode closer to the house, he could see a woman working in the garden. She was bent over a row of tomato plants, her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and mended with care. When she heard his horse's hooves on the packed earth of the yard, she straightened up and turned toward him, one hand shading her eyes from the sun. Martha Henderson was 32 years old, though the prairie sun and the hard work of running a ranch alone had added a few lines around her green eyes. She had been beautiful once, the kind of beauty that made men trip over their own feet and forget how to speak properly. She was still beautiful, but it was a different kind of beauty now, tempered by grief and hardened by necessity. When she saw the stranger riding into her yard, she felt her heart skip in a way it hadn't for 3 years. Jake pulled up his horse about 20 feet from where she stood and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from days without much use. "I don't mean to bother you, but I was wondering if you might have some work that needs doing. I'm handy with tools and not afraid of hard labor." Martha studied him carefully. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending years under the open sky. His clothes were dusty and worn but clean, and his eyes, though tired, were honest. More importantly, he was alone. No gang of riders following behind him, no weapons drawn, no threat in his posture. Just a lone man looking for work, which was exactly what she'd been hoping would ride into her life for the past 3 years. "What's your name?" she asked, stepping a little closer but staying well out of arm's reach. A woman alone couldn't be too careful, even with someone who looked harmless. "Jake Morrison, ma'am. I've done ranch work most of my life. I can fix fences, tend animals, whatever needs doing." Martha let her eyes travel over him again, taking in the way he sat his horse, the calluses on his hands, the honest weariness in his face. He looked like a man who'd been riding hard and eating light, which meant he was probably desperate enough to take whatever work she offered and grateful enough not to ask too many questions. "I'm Martha Henderson," she said, and then she smiled. It was a careful smile, practiced and calculated, but it transformed her face completely. "My husband died 3 years ago, and I've been trying to keep this place running by myself ever since. I could use some help, if you're willing to work for room and board plus a small wage." Jake felt something loosen in his chest at that smile. It had been a long time since a woman had smiled at him like that, like he was worth something. "I'd be much obliged, Mrs. Henderson. I'm not looking for charity, just honest work." "It's hard work," she warned him. "The cattle are scattered across 1,000 acres, half the fence line needs repair, and the barn roof has been leaking since the last big storm. It's not a job for someone looking to take it easy." "I'm not looking to take it easy, ma'am. I'm looking to earn my keep." Martha nodded, as if she'd made a decision. "There's a bunkhouse behind the barn where you can sleep. It's not much, but it's clean and dry. Supper's at 6, and I expect you at the table with clean hands and a respectful attitude. Breakfast is at sunrise, and work starts right after. Sundays you can rest, but the animals still need tending." "That sounds more than fair, Mrs. Henderson. Just Martha will do fine. Now put your horse in the corral and get yourself settled. I'll show you around the place after supper." Jake touched his hat brim again and rode toward the corral. As he unsaddled Bessie and turned her loose with the other horses, he could feel Martha's eyes on him. He wondered what she was thinking, what she was looking for. In his experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. But he was tired and hungry and running out of options, so he decided to take whatever good fortune had come his way and not question it too hard. The bunkhouse was exactly what she'd promised, clean and simple. There was a narrow bed with a cornhusk mattress, a small table, and a wash basin. Someone had left a bar of soap and a clean towel, which struck him as a thoughtful touch. He washed the dust from his face and hands, changed into his one clean shirt, and tried to make himself presentable for supper. Martha's house was comfortable but not fancy. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a stone fireplace at one end and a cast-iron stove at the other. The table was set for two, and the smell of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air. Jake's stomach growled so loud he was embarrassed, but Martha just smiled and ladled stew into his bowl. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while," she said. "A day or two," he admitted. "I'm grateful for the meal." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The stew was rich and hearty, filled with chunks of beef and vegetables from her garden. The bread was still warm from the oven. Jake tried not to wolf down the food, but it was the best meal he'd had in weeks. "Tell me about yourself, Jake Morrison," Martha said when they'd both taken the edge off their hunger. "Where do you come from?" Jake set down his spoon and looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, she looked younger somehow, softer. "Originally from Kansas. Had a small ranch there with my wife until raiders burned us out 5 years ago. Sarah, my wife, she died that winter from fever. I'd been drifting ever since." "I'm sorry for your loss," Martha said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who understood grief. "It's hard, losing someone you love. Changes everything." "It does," Jake agreed. "What about your husband? If you don't mind my asking." Martha's face tightened slightly, but she answered. "Thomas died in a riding accident. His horse stepped in a hole and threw him. Broke his neck. One day he was here, laughing at breakfast, and by evening he was gone." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "We've been married 8 years, but we never had children. So when he died, I was left with this place and no one to help run it." "Why didn't you sell? Move somewhere easier?" Martha's green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "This is my home. Thomas and I built this place together. I'm not going to run just because it's hard." Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment. He'd felt the same way about his own place, until circumstances had made staying impossible. "Takes courage to stay. Or stubbornness," Martha said with a slight smile. "My mother always said I had too much of that for my own good." After supper, Martha showed him around the ranch. The barn was solidly built but needed work on the roof, just as she'd said. The cattle were scattered across the range, maybe 200 head, not a huge operation but respectable for a single person to manage. The fence line did need repair in several places, and there were a dozen other tasks that needed attention. "I've been doing what I can," Martha said as they walked back toward the house. But there's only so much one person can accomplish. The ranch is slowly falling behind, and I can't afford to hire help from town. What about neighbors? Surely someone would lend a hand. Martha's expression darkened. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. Thomas used to ride over there sometimes, but since he died, they've made it clear they think a woman has no business trying to run a ranch alone. They've offered to buy me out several times, but always for less than half what the place is worth. Jake could hear the bitterness in her voice, and he understood it. He'd seen how some people treated widows, as if losing a husband had made them helpless children who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. "Well, you've got help now," he said. "I'll start on the fence line tomorrow." Martha stopped walking and turned to face him. In the moonlight, her face was pale and beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you willing to work for so little? A man with your skills could find better paying work in town." Jake thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated, involving loneliness and guilt and the way her smile had made him feel like maybe he wasn't completely worthless. But he settled for a simpler truth. "Because you need help, and I need a place to belong, even if it's just for a while." Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Jake Morrison. We'll see how this works out." As they reached the house, she paused with her hand on the door. "One thing you should know," she said. "I'm not looking for a husband. I'm not looking for romance or complications. I just need someone I can trust to help me keep this place running." "I understand," Jake said, though he felt a small stab of disappointment. "I'm just here to work." But, as he walked back to the bunkhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Martha Henderson was more complicated than she was letting on. There had been something in her eyes when she talked about her husband's death, something that didn't quite match the grief in her voice. And the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked why he was willing to work for so little, as if she was measuring him for something other than ranch work. Jake had learned to trust his instincts during his years of drifting, and those instincts were telling him that Martha Henderson was hiding something. But he was too tired, too hungry for a place to belong, to listen to the warning bells in his head. Besides, what could a lonely widow possibly be hiding that would matter to a drifter like him? He fell asleep that night to the sound of coyotes howling in the distance, unaware that Martha Henderson was sitting by her window, watching the bunkhouse and making plans that would change both their lives forever. 3 years of grief and isolation had changed her in ways that even she didn't fully understand. The woman who had smiled at him over supper was not the same woman who had married Thomas Henderson 8 years ago. That woman had died with her husband, and what remained was something harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous. But Jake Morrison didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that he had found a place that needed him, and, for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. The next 3 weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm that Jake hadn't experienced in years. He woke before dawn to the sound of Martha moving around in the kitchen, dressed quickly, and met her for breakfast. They would discuss the day's work over coffee and eggs, then Jake would head out to tackle whatever needed doing while Martha tended to the house and garden. The work was hard but satisfying. Jake spent his first week repairing the fence line, riding the perimeter of the ranch and fixing breaks where cattle had pushed through or weather had weakened the posts. It was solitary work that gave him time to think, and he found himself thinking about Martha more than he probably should have. She was different from other women he'd known. His wife Sarah had been gentle and dependent, looking to him for protection and guidance in all things. Martha was clearly capable of taking care of herself, but there were moments when he caught her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Sometimes it seemed almost calculating, as if she was figuring out how to use him for something. Other times, usually when she didn't know he was watching, she looked incredibly lonely. On his second week, Jake started working on the barn roof. It was dangerous work, made more difficult by the late summer heat, but he was grateful for the challenge. Physical labor had always been his way of working through problems, and he had plenty to work through. Being around Martha was stirring up feelings he thought were buried with his wife. Martha brought him lunch every day while he worked on the roof, appearing at the base of the ladder with sandwiches and cool water just when the heat was becoming unbearable. They would sit in the shade of the barn and talk while he ate. These conversations were the highlight of his day, even though Martha was careful to keep them impersonal. She would ask about his progress on various tasks, mention things that needed attention around the ranch, or talk about the weather and the cattle. But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't paying attention, Jake would catch her studying him with those green eyes, and he would wonder what she was really thinking. "You're a hard worker, Jake Morrison," she said one afternoon as he climbed down from the roof. "I haven't seen anyone attack a job the way you do since Thomas died." Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Just trying to earn my keep." "You've earned it and more. I was thinking maybe it's time we talked about making this arrangement more permanent." Jake felt his heart skip. "Permanent?" Martha smiled, but there was something careful about it. "I mean a real salary, not just room and board. Maybe a percentage of the cattle sales come spring. You've proven yourself reliable, and I could use someone I can count on for the long haul." "I'd like that," Jake said, surprised by how much he meant it. "I'd like that a lot." "Good. We can work out the details over supper tonight." As Martha walked back toward the house, Jake watched her go and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The idea of staying in one place, of building something lasting again, was both thrilling and terrifying. He'd been drifting for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have roots. That evening, over a supper of fried chicken and fresh vegetables, Martha laid out her proposal. Jake would receive a monthly salary plus a quarter share of any profits from cattle sales. In return, he would commit to staying at least 2 years, long enough to help her get the ranch back on solid footing. "There's one more thing," Martha said as they finished their meal. "I'd been thinking about expanding the herd. There's good grazing land to the north that's not being used, but it would mean more work, and I'd need someone I could trust completely." "You can trust me," Jake said without hesitation. Martha looked at him across the table, her green eyes serious. "Can I? Really? Because what I'm thinking about doing, it's not entirely legal." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Martha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. "That land to the north, it belongs to Samuel Garrett. He's the neighbor I mentioned, the one who's been trying to buy me out. He owns a spread 3 times the size of mine, but he's too lazy to use all of it properly. Meanwhile, I'm struggling to keep my cattle fed on the land I have. You're talking about grazing your cattle on his land without permission. I'm talking about using land that's going to waste while my animals suffer. Garrett has more than he needs, and I have less. Where's the justice in that?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. He understood desperation, understood the choices it could force a person to make. But he also understood the difference between right and wrong, and what Martha was suggesting was theft, plain and simple. "Martha," he said carefully, "I know things are hard, but stealing grass is still stealing. If Garrett caught us, he could have us arrested, or worse." Martha turned from the window, and, in the lamplight, her face looked harder than he'd ever seen it. "Samuel Garrett killed my husband." Jake felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "Oh, he didn't pull a trigger or swing a rope. But he might as well have. Thomas went to see him 3 years ago, to ask about buying some of that northern grazing land. Garrett not only refused, he threatened to run our cattle off if they so much as set foot on his property. Then, he offered to buy our ranch for a fraction of what it was worth, said a woman couldn't run a place like this anyway." Martha's voice was getting harder, more bitter. "Thomas was so angry when he came home. He said he was going to show Garrett that the Hendersons weren't going to be pushed around. He rode out the next morning to move our cattle closer to the northern boundary, just to prove a point. That's when his horse stepped in the hole that broke his neck." Jake could see the pain in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Something that made him uncomfortable. "That doesn't mean Garrett killed him. Accidents happen." "Do they?" Martha stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing. Funny how that hole appeared right where Thomas would be riding, right after he'd had that argument with Garrett. Funny how Garrett showed up at the funeral and offered to buy the ranch again before Thomas was even in the ground. Jake felt cold despite the warm evening. You think Garrett dug that hole deliberately? I think Samuel Garrett wanted our land, and I think he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. Thomas was in his way, and now Thomas is dead. Jake stood up from the table, his mind racing. If what Martha suspected was true, then Garrett was a murderer who had gotten away with it. But suspicion wasn't proof, and even if it was true, stealing his grass wasn't going to bring Thomas back. Even if you're right, Jake said, this isn't the way to get justice. Taking his cattle to graze on his land is just going to give him an excuse to come after you legally. Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think the law is going to help me? Garrett owns the sheriff, owns half the judges in the territory. You think anyone's going to take the word of a grieving widow against a man with his money and connections? Jake could see her point, but it didn't make what she was suggesting right. So what's your plan? Graze your cattle on his land until he catches you? Then, what? Martha moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the soap she used and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. My plan is to make him pay for what he did to Thomas. My plan is to take everything he took from me, plus interest. Martha, you're talking about a war you can't win. Garrett has more men, more money, more everything. If you go after him, he'll destroy you. Maybe. Or maybe he'll make a mistake, get careless because he doesn't think a woman is a real threat. Maybe I'll find a way to prove what he did to Thomas. Jake could see the determination in her face, but he could also see the desperation underneath it. This was a woman who had been alone too long, who had let her grief and anger fester until it had poisoned her judgment. I won't be part of it, he said quietly. I'll stay and help you with the ranch, but I won't help you steal from Garrett or anyone else. Martha's expression changed, becoming cold and distant. I see. So you're just like all the rest of them. When it comes down to it, you'll side with the man with money over the woman who needs help. That's not fair, and you know it. This isn't about taking sides, it's about right and wrong. Right and wrong? Martha's voice rose. What's right about a murderer getting away with it? What's right about him trying to steal my land while I struggle to survive? Jake could see that she was beyond reason, at least for tonight. Maybe we should talk about this in the morning, when we've both had time to think. Martha stared at him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. Maybe we should. Good night, Jake. Jake walked back to the bunkhouse with a heavy heart. 3 weeks of growing hope and contentment had just crashed down around him. He'd thought he'd found a place where he could belong, a woman he could care about, maybe even love in time. But the woman he'd seen tonight wasn't the same one who had smiled at him over supper for the past 3 weeks. This woman was consumed by grief and anger and a thirst for revenge that was going to destroy her if she didn't let it go. He lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. Part of him wanted to pack up and ride out in the morning, before he got any deeper involved in Martha's problems. But another part of him couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone with her anger and her dangerous plans. Martha Henderson was not the woman he'd thought she was, but she was still a woman in pain, and Jake Morrison had never been able to walk away from someone who needed help, even when they refused to admit they needed it. The next morning, Martha was polite but distant at breakfast. She asked about his plans for the day and discussed ranch business as if their conversation the night before had never happened. Jake played along, but he could feel the tension between them, could see the careful calculation in her eyes whenever she looked at him. He spent the day working on the barn roof, but his heart wasn't in it. He kept thinking about what Martha had told him about her husband's death, about Samuel Garrett and the hole that had killed Thomas Henderson. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. That evening, after another awkwardly polite supper, Jake made a decision that would change everything. I want to see where it happened, he said as Martha cleared the dishes. Where Thomas died. Martha froze, a plate halfway to the wash basin. Why? Because if you're right about Garrett, then someone should pay for what happened to Thomas. But if you're wrong, then you're about to destroy your life chasing ghosts. Martha set down the plate and turned to face him. And you think you can tell the difference? I think I can try. I've seen my share of accidents and my share of murder. Maybe I can see something you missed. Martha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. All right. We'll ride out there tomorrow morning. But, as Jake headed back to the bunkhouse that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. Getting involved in Martha's war with Samuel Garrett was dangerous enough. But, there was something else bothering him, something about the way Martha had looked at him when he'd offered to examine the site where her husband died. She'd looked pleased, but not relieved or grateful. She'd looked pleased the way a person looks when a complicated plan is finally starting to come together. Jake Morrison was beginning to suspect that he'd been wrong about a lot of things regarding Martha Henderson. But, by then, it was already too late to turn back. The ride to the place where Thomas Henderson died took them across the northern section of Martha's ranch, through rolling grassland that showed signs of overgrazing. The cattle had eaten the good grass down to stubble, and, in places, the prairie was beginning to show patches of bare earth where nothing would grow. Jake could see why Martha was worried about her herd. The land couldn't support this many animals through another dry spell, and the cattle were already looking thin despite the relatively good summer they'd had. It reinforced his understanding of Martha's desperation, even if it didn't justify the illegal scheme she was considering. Martha rode beside him in silence, her face set in hard lines that made her look older than her years. She'd been different since their conversation 2 nights ago, more distant but also more intense, as if she was working up the courage to do something irreversible. Jake found himself watching her carefully, trying to read her intentions. It's just ahead, Martha said finally, pointing toward a small rise about a quarter-mile away. Past those rocks, where the land dips down toward Garrett's property line. As they crested the rise, Jake could see the spot she meant. It was a natural depression in the prairie, maybe 30 feet across and 10 feet deep, the kind of place where water would collect during storms and create a small seasonal pond. The grass was greener there, and there were signs that cattle came to drink when water was available. At the bottom of the depression, partially hidden by taller grass, Jake could see what remained of the hole that had killed Thomas Henderson. 3 years of weather had softened its edges, but it was still visible as a slight depression in the earth, maybe 2 feet across. Thomas was riding down that slope, Martha said, pointing to the gentle incline that led into the depression. His horse stepped in the hole and went down hard. Threw Thomas headfirst into those rocks over there. Jake studied the terrain carefully. It was exactly the kind of accident that could happen to any rider crossing unfamiliar ground, especially at night or in poor weather. But, as he examined the site more closely, he began to notice things that bothered him. When did this happen? He asked. Early morning, just after sunrise. Thomas had ridden out at dawn to check on some cattle he thought might have wandered toward Garrett's land. And, when did you find him? Martha's voice became strained. That afternoon. When he didn't come back for lunch, I got worried and rode out looking for him. Found him at the bottom of the slope, already cold. Jake dismounted and walked down into the depression, studying the ground carefully. The area around where the hole had been was still slightly different from the surrounding earth, as if it had been disturbed and, then, settled again over time. But, what really caught his attention were the rocks Martha had mentioned. They were scattered in a rough circle around what would have been the impact site, but they didn't look like they belonged there. The rest of the depression was covered in grass and soft earth, but these rocks were hard granite, the kind that would have had to be carried from somewhere else. Martha, he called up to her, these rocks, were they here before the accident? Martha rode down to join him, her face carefully neutral. I don't know. I never paid much attention to this spot before Thomas died. Why? Jake knelt beside one of the larger rocks, running his fingers over its surface. Because these aren't prairie stones. This is granite, probably from the hills 20 miles south of here. Someone would have had to bring them here deliberately. He could feel Martha watching him, but when he looked up at her, her expression was unreadable. What are you saying? I'm saying if someone wanted to make sure a throne rider would be badly hurt or killed, scattering rocks around like this would be one way to do it. Jake stood up and walked to where the hole had been. Even after 3 years, he could see that the earth had been disturbed in a roughly circular pattern, as if someone had dug it out and, then, tried to make it look natural again. "This wasn't a gopher hole," he said quietly. "Someone dug this deliberately." Martha dismounted and came to stand beside him. When he looked at her, he expected to see vindication or grief or anger. Instead, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Martha Henderson looked satisfied, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. "So I was right," she said. "Garrett murdered my husband." Jake felt the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving start to fall into place. "How did you know to bring me here, Martha? How did you know I'd be able to see what you saw?" Martha's smile was sharp and cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been planning this from the moment I rode into your yard. You needed someone to confirm your suspicions about Thomas's death, someone who would believe that Garrett killed your husband. But, more than that, you needed someone who would help you do something about it." Martha's mask slipped for just a moment, and Jake saw the calculation underneath. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jake stepped closer to her, his voice hard. 3 weeks you've been watching me, measuring me, figuring out exactly how to hook me into whatever scheme you're running. The Lonely Widow Act, the gradual revelation about your husband's death, the suggestion that Garrett was responsible. You've been playing me from the start." Martha's face flushed with anger. "Thomas is dead, Jake. Murdered. That's not an act." "No, Thomas is dead. But, I'm beginning to wonder if Samuel Garrett had anything to do with it." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Martha stared at him for a long moment, then threw back her head and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Jake Morrison. But, not quite smart enough." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "What do you mean?" Martha walked back to her horse and pulled something from her saddlebags. When she turned around, she was holding a small pistol, pointed directly at his chest. "I mean you're right about some things and wrong about others. Samuel Garrett didn't kill Thomas. I did." Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. "What?" "I killed my husband, Jake. Dug that hole myself, scattered those rocks, then sent him riding out here with a story about strayed cattle. Poor Thomas, always so eager to prove himself, so determined to show the world that he could handle any problem that came up." Martha's voice was calm, almost conversational, but her eyes were bright with a fever that hadn't been there before. "Did you know that Thomas was planning to sell the ranch? He'd gotten an offer from a cattle company in Denver, and he was going to take it without even asking what I thought. After 8 years of marriage, 8 years of building this place together, he was going to sell it and move us to the city because he was tired of the hard work." Jake couldn't find his voice. The woman standing in front of him was a stranger, someone he'd never met despite living and working beside her for 3 weeks. "I couldn't let that happen," Martha continued. "This ranch is my life, my identity. Everything I am is tied up in this land. So I made sure Thomas couldn't sell it." "You're insane," Jake whispered. Martha smiled. "Maybe. But, I'm also very, very clever. Do you know how long I've been planning this? How long I've been waiting for someone like you to ride into my life?" Jake's hand moved slowly toward his gun, but Martha shook her head. "I wouldn't try that if I were you. I'm a very good shot, and, at this range, I won't miss." "What do you want from me, Martha?" "I want you to help me kill Samuel Garrett." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "What?" "Garrett has been trying to buy my ranch for 3 years. He's made it clear that he thinks a woman can't run a place like this, and he's been waiting for me to fail so he can pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. But, if something were to happen to him, his land would probably go to his nephew back east, a man who knows nothing about ranching and would be happy to sell to the right buyer." Martha's eyes were bright with excitement now. "With Garrett's land added to mine, I'd have one of the biggest spreads in the territory. Enough grazing to support a herd 3 times the size of what I have now. Enough to make me rich. And, you want me to help you murder him?" I want you to help me give him exactly what he deserves. Garrett has spent 3 years trying to drive me off this land, trying to take advantage of a grieving widow. It's time someone showed him that actions have consequences. Jake felt sick. Why me? Why not hire a gunfighter or an outlaw? Because you're perfect, Jake Morrison. You're a drifter with no family, no ties, no one who will miss you when you're gone. You're also honest and decent, which means people will believe you when you tell them that Garrett attacked you and you killed him in self-defense. The full scope of Martha's plan hit Jake like a landslide. You're planning to kill me too? Martha nodded, looking pleased that he'd figured it out. After you killed Garrett, of course. Can't have any witnesses to my involvement. The story will be that you and Garrett had some kind of dispute, maybe over wages or working conditions. You killed him, then fled into the hills where you died of exposure or an accident. Very sad, very tragic, but these things happen in wild country. Jake felt the world spinning around him. 3 weeks of growing hope and affection, 3 weeks of thinking he'd found a place where he could belong, and it had all been an elaborate setup for murder. You've been planning this from the moment I arrived. From the moment I saw you riding up to my house. A lone drifter, desperate for work, grateful for any kindness. I knew immediately that you were exactly what I needed. Martha's smile was radiant, as if she was discussing plans for a church social instead of double murder. I've had 3 years to work out the details, Jake. 3 years to figure out every possible angle. This is going to work. Jake looked around the depression where they stood, seeing it now as the trap it had always been. Martha had brought him here not to show him evidence of Garrett's guilt, but to make her final pitch for his cooperation. She was confident enough in her control over him to reveal the truth, which meant she was also confident that he wouldn't be leaving this place alive if he refused to help her. And if I say no? Martha's expression didn't change, but her finger tightened slightly on the trigger of her pistol. Then, you'll have an accident, just like Thomas did. A tragic fall from your horse, maybe, or a snake bite that you couldn't recover from. I'll bury you somewhere on the ranch and tell people you decided to move on without saying goodbye. Drifters do that sometimes. Jake could see that she meant every word. Whatever grief and isolation had done to Martha Henderson over the past 3 years, it had created something monstrous. She was completely calm, completely rational, and completely without conscience. Think about it, Jake, she said, her voice becoming persuasive again. Help me with this, and I'll make you a full partner in the ranch. We can build something together, something bigger and better than anything either of us could create alone. All you have to do is kill one man who deserves to die anyway. Jake looked into her green eyes and saw madness disguised as sanity, desperation disguised as strength. Martha Henderson had crossed a line 3 years ago when she'd murdered her husband, and now she was so far beyond normal human feelings that she couldn't even understand why he might be horrified by her proposal. I need time to think about it, he said carefully. Martha studied his face, looking for signs of deception. How much time? A day. Maybe 2. This is a big decision. Martha nodded slowly. 2 days. But don't try to run, Jake. I know this country better than you do, and I have friends in town who would be very interested to hear about a dangerous drifter who threatened a defenseless widow. She was right, and they both knew it. Jake was trapped as surely as if he was in a jail cell. Martha had all the advantages, all the connections, all the credibility. If he tried to expose her, who would believe the word of a homeless drifter against that of a respected rancher's widow? 2 days, Jake agreed. Martha smiled and lowered her pistol. Good. I knew you were a reasonable man. Come on, let's head back to the ranch. I'll make us a nice supper, and we can start planning how to approach Garrett. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Jake felt the walls of Martha's trap closing around him. She had planned this perfectly, using his loneliness and desperation to lure him into a situation where he had no good choices. Help her commit murder, or die himself. But Martha Henderson had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She had assumed that because Jake Morrison was a drifter, he was also a coward. she was about to learn that there was a big difference between the two. That night, Jake lay awake in the bunkhouse staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to stay alive. Martha had made her position crystal clear. He could help her murder Samuel Garrett and then probably be murdered himself when he was no longer useful, or he could refuse and definitely be murdered right away. Neither option appealed to him. The smart thing would be to saddle up Bessie in the dead of night and ride as hard and fast as he could toward the next territory. But Martha was right about knowing the country better than he did, and she was also right about having friends in town. If she raised the alarm that a dangerous drifter had threatened her, every lawman within 100 miles would be looking for him. More importantly, Jake Morrison had spent 5 years running from his problems, and he was tired of it. Martha Henderson was a murderer who was planning to kill again, and someone had to stop her. If he ran, Garrett would die, and probably the next drifter who was unlucky enough to ride into Martha's yard would share Jake's current predicament. The question was how to stop her without getting himself killed in the process. Jake had noticed several things during their ride to the murder site that Martha probably didn't realize he'd seen. For one thing, she was left-handed, which meant when she'd pointed that pistol at him, she'd been holding it in her dominant hand. That suggested she really was a good shot, just as she'd claimed. For another thing, she'd been jumpy during the ride home, constantly looking around as if she expected someone to be watching them. That suggested she wasn't as confident as she pretended to be. A woman who had gotten away with murder once might be feeling the pressure of trying to do it again. Most importantly, Jake had noticed that Martha kept checking her pocket watch during supper, as if she was timing something or waiting for something to happen. When he'd asked her about it, she'd brushed off the question, but he'd seen the flash of nervousness in her eyes. Martha Henderson was hiding something else, something beyond her plans to murder Garrett and frame Jake for it. The question was what, and whether Jake could figure it out before it was too late. The next morning at breakfast, Martha was cheerful and talkative, discussing their plans as if they were organizing a barn raising instead of a murder. "I've been thinking about the best way to approach Garrett," she said as she poured coffee. "He rides his northern boundary every Thursday morning, checking on his cattle. If we positioned ourselves along his usual route, it would be easy to make it look like a chance encounter." "And then, what?" Jake asked, playing along while he tried to gather more information. "Then, you pick a fight with him. Doesn't matter about what, just something to justify shooting him. Maybe accuse him of letting his cattle wander onto my land, or suggest that he's been watering his stock at my water holes. Garrett's got a temper, so it won't take much to get him angry." Jake nodded as if he was considering the plan. "What about his men? Doesn't he usually travel with ranch hands?" Martha's expression flickered slightly. "He rides alone on Thursday mornings. Always has, ever since his wife died 2 years ago. Says it's his time to think and plan." Something about the way she said it bothered Jake, but he couldn't put his finger on what. "You seem to know his schedule pretty well." "I've been watching him for 3 years, Jake. I know everything about Samuel Garrett's habits." After breakfast, Martha announced that she needed to ride into town for supplies. "I'll be gone most of the day," she said. "Why don't you work on fixing that gate in the north pasture? The one that's been giving us trouble." Jake nodded and watched her ride away, then immediately saddled his own horse and followed at a distance. If Martha was really going to town, she would take the main road south. Instead, she headed northwest, toward what Jake knew was Samuel Garrett's land. Jake followed her for an hour, staying well back and using the rolling terrain to keep out of sight. When Martha finally stopped, it was at the top of a ridge that overlooked Garrett's ranch buildings. She pulled out a pair of field glasses and spent nearly 20 minutes studying the layout below. From his hiding place behind a stand of cottonwood trees, Jake could see what she was looking at. Garrett's ranch was a prosperous-looking operation, with a large house, several barns, and numerous corrals. There were cattle scattered across the nearby pastures, and Jake could see several riders working with the herds. But what really caught his attention was what Martha was focused on. She wasn't looking at the general layout of the ranch. She was studying the house, and, specifically, the windows on the second floor. After she'd seen whatever she was looking for, Martha rode back toward her own ranch, taking a different route than the one she'd used to arrive. Jake followed again, staying far enough back to avoid detection but close enough to see where she went. Instead of heading straight home, Martha stopped at a small line shack on the boundary between her land and Garrett's. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows broken and its roof sagging, but Martha dismounted and went inside. She emerged a few minutes later carrying what looked like a canvas bag, which she secured to her saddle before riding home. Jake waited until she was out of sight, then rode to the line shack himself. The inside was mostly empty except for an old table, a broken chair, and a pile of moldy blankets in one corner. But when Jake examined the floor carefully, he could see fresh scratches in the dirt where something heavy had been dragged. In the corner where the blankets lay, Jake found what Martha had been hiding. Scraped into the wooden floor, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, were initials. TH plus MH. Thomas and Martha Henderson, carved into the wood in the careful script of someone taking his time. Below the initials, in fresher carving that looked like it had been done much more recently, were the words "Soon, my love." Jake felt his blood run cold as the final pieces of Martha's puzzle fell into place. The abandoned line shack, the fresh carving, the way Martha had been watching Garrett's house through her field glasses. She wasn't just planning to kill Samuel Garrett for his land. This was personal. Thomas Henderson hadn't been killed because he wanted to sell the ranch. He'd been killed because he'd been having an affair with someone, and Martha had found out about it. The line shack was where the lovers had been meeting, and Martha's plan for revenge was far more complex and twisted than Jake had realized. But if Thomas had been meeting someone here, who was it? And what did it have to do with Samuel Garrett? Jake thought about Martha's behavior over the past few weeks, the way she'd been watching him, measuring his reactions. He thought about her insistence that Garrett was responsible for Thomas's death, and her detailed knowledge of Garrett's personal habits. Then, he remembered something that chilled him to the bone. Martha had said that Garrett's wife had died 2 years ago, a year after Thomas. She'd also mentioned that Garrett rode alone every Thursday morning since his wife's death, because it was his time to think and plan. What if Thomas Henderson hadn't been having an affair with some unknown woman? What if he'd been having an affair with Samuel Garrett's wife? That would explain everything. Martha's intimate knowledge of Garrett's schedule and habits. Her personal hatred of the man. Her confidence that she could get close enough to him to arrange his murder. And, most importantly, it would explain why she needed Jake to be the one to pull the trigger. If Martha killed Garrett herself, people might wonder about her motives. But, if a drifter killed him in what appeared to be a chance encounter, no one would think to connect it to events that had happened 3 years ago. Jake rode back to the ranch with his mind racing. Martha's plan was even more diabolical than he'd initially thought. She had killed her husband for his infidelity, and now she was planning to kill her husband's lover's widower, using Jake as her weapon. But, knowing Martha's true motives didn't solve Jake's immediate problem. He was still trapped, still facing a choice between murder and death. What he needed was a way to turn the tables on Martha, to use her own plan against her. That evening at supper, Martha was in an excellent mood. She talked about the supplies she'd supposedly bought in town, asked about his progress on the gate repair, and generally acted like a woman without a care in the world. "Have you thought any more about our discussion yesterday?" she asked as they finished their meal. "I have," Jake said carefully. "And I think you're right. Garrett deserves what's coming to him." Martha's smile lit up her entire face. "I knew you'd see reason. You're a good man, Jake Morrison, and good men understand the importance of justice. When do we do it?" "Tomorrow is Thursday. Garrett will be making his morning ride just like always. We'll position ourselves along his route and wait for him to come to us." "And after? What's the plan for getting away?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's the beauty of it. We won't be getting away. You'll be dead, remember? Shot by Garrett in the struggle. I'll be the grieving widow who found your bodies and reported the tragedy to the sheriff." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "What about the gun? How do we make it look like Garrett shot me? I've got that figured out too. After you shoot Garrett, I'll take his gun and put a bullet in you with it. Then, I'll put the gun back in his hand. When the sheriff investigates, it'll look like you and Garrett shot each other. Jake felt sick at how calmly Martha discussed his murder, but he kept his expression neutral. You've really thought of everything. I've had 3 years to plan this, Jake. 3 years to work out every detail. Nothing is going to go wrong. But, as Jake headed back to the bunkhouse that night, he was counting on Martha being wrong about that. Because while she'd been planning his death for 3 years, Jake Morrison had been surviving by his wits for 5 years, and he had no intention of letting a murderous widow add him to her list of victims. The question was whether he could turn the tables on Martha Henderson before she got the chance to kill him. And whether anyone would believe his story when the dust settled. Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, with a hint of the autumn that was coming. Jake woke before sunrise and lay in his narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of Martha moving around in the kitchen and preparing for what she thought would be the culmination of 3 years of planning. Jake had spent most of the night working out his own plan, and it was risky enough that he wasn't sure it would work. But it was the only chance he had to survive the day and see that justice was done for Thomas Henderson and anyone else Martha might decide to murder in the future. At breakfast, Martha was practically vibrating with excitement, though she tried to hide it behind her usual calm demeanor. She dressed carefully in her best riding clothes and had braided her dark hair in a style that made her look younger and more innocent. Nervous, she asked Jake as she poured his coffee. A little, Jake admitted, which was true enough. I've never killed a man before. Martha reached across the table and patted his hand in a gesture that might have looked comforting to an outside observer. It's easier than you think, once you make up your mind to do it. The hard part is living with yourself afterward, but that won't be a problem for you. The casual cruelty of the statement took Jake's breath away. Martha Henderson was so far beyond normal human feeling that she could discuss his impending murder as if she was giving him advice about breaking a horse. I've packed us some food and water, Martha continued, gesturing toward a canvas bag on the counter. We might be waiting for a while, depending on Garrett's schedule. And you're sure he'll come alone? I'm sure. Samuel Garrett is a creature of habit, Jake. That's what's going to get him killed. After breakfast, they saddled their horses and rode north toward the boundary between Martha's land and Garrett's. The route took them past the depression where Thomas Henderson had died, and Jake noticed that Martha didn't even glance in that direction. Whatever guilt she might have felt about her husband's murder had been buried so deep that it no longer affected her. The spot Martha had chosen for the ambush was perfect from a tactical standpoint. A narrow trail ran between two low hills, creating a natural bottleneck where a rider would be forced to pass within easy shooting distance. There were plenty of rocks and brush to provide cover, and multiple escape routes if things went wrong. Garrett usually comes through here around 10 o'clock, Martha said as they took their positions behind a cluster of boulders. We'll wait until he's committed to the trail, then you step out and confront him. Remember, you need to make him angry enough to draw his gun first. That's crucial for making this look like self-defense. Jake nodded and checked his pistol, making sure it was loaded and ready. What if he doesn't draw? What if he tries to ride away? He won't. Samuel Garrett has too much pride to back down from a fight, especially with someone he sees as beneath him. Trust me, Jake, I know this man. They settled in to wait, and Jake used the time to study the terrain and refine his plan. The key was timing. Everything depended on him being in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment. At 5 minutes past 10, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Martha tensed beside him, her hand moving to the pistol at her hip. That's him, she whispered. Remember, wait until I give you the signal. Samuel Garrett appeared at the mouth of the trail riding a magnificent black stallion. He was a big man in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man who owned everything he could see and wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. Jake studied Garrett's face as he approached, looking for signs of the kind of man who would seduce another man's wife. What he saw was someone who looked tired and sad, riding alone through country that should have made him feel proud and instead seemed to weigh on him like a burden. "Now," Martha whispered. Jake stood up from behind the boulder and stepped into the trail, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Samuel Garrett?" Garrett pulled up his horse and studied Jake carefully. "That's right. Who's asking?" "Jake Morrison. I work for Martha Henderson." Something changed in Garrett's expression at the mention of Martha's name. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "What does Mrs. Henderson want with me?" Garrett asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jake could feel Martha watching him from her hiding place, waiting for him to provoke the confrontation that would justify Garrett's murder. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything. "She wants to talk to you about her husband's death," Jake said. "She thinks you killed him." Garrett's face went pale. "Thomas Henderson died in an accident." His horse stepped in a hole. A hole that someone dug deliberately. A hole surrounded by rocks that someone carried there from 20 miles away. Garrett stared at Jake for a long moment, then slowly dismounted from his horse. "Who are you really, Morrison?" "I'm someone who's been lied to and manipulated by a woman who murdered her husband and is planning to murder you. The question is, are you going to help me stop her?" There was a moment of absolute silence, then Martha stepped out from behind the rocks with her pistol drawn and pointed at Jake's back. "Very good, Jake," she said, her voice cold as winter wind. "I was beginning to wonder if you were going to go through with it. But this works even better. Now I can kill both of you and claim that you were working together to rob and murder me." Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, but Martha's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't, Samuel. I'm a much better shot than either of you, and, from this range, I won't miss." Garrett's eyes met Jake's, and, in that moment, an understanding passed between them. They were both trapped by a woman who had planned their deaths with the same care that other people plan Sunday dinner. "Why, Martha?" Garrett asked, his voice heavy with grief. "Why did you kill Thomas?" Martha laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Because he was a cheating bastard who thought he could throw away 8 years of marriage for a few nights with your precious Elizabeth." Garrett flinched as if he'd been struck. "Elizabeth's been dead for 2 years. And she should have been dead 4 years ago, before she destroyed my marriage. Do you know how long I watched them, Samuel? How many times I followed Thomas to that little line shack where they met? How many lies I had to swallow while my husband pretended to love me?" Jake could see that Martha was losing control, her carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of 3 years of buried rage. This was his chance. "Elizabeth Garrett died of consumption," Jake said, taking a small step sideways to put himself between Martha and Garrett. "She was sick for months before she died. How does that make her responsible for your husband's infidelity?" Martha's eyes blazed with fury. "She seduced him. She took advantage of his good nature and his loneliness." "Thomas was lonely?" Jake asked, taking another small step. "But he was married to you. Why would he be lonely?" "Because I couldn't give him what he wanted." Martha screamed, all pretense of sanity finally abandoning her. "I couldn't give him children, couldn't give him the perfect little family he dreamed about. So he went looking for it somewhere else." The pieces finally clicked into place for Jake. Martha's desperate need to keep the ranch, her isolation, her growing madness. She hadn't just lost her husband to infidelity. She'd lost her sense of purpose, her identity, everything she thought made her worthwhile as a woman. "So you killed him," Jake said softly. "You killed the man you loved because he loved someone else." "I killed him because he was going to leave me with nothing." Martha's voice cracked with pain. "He was going to sell the ranch and move to Denver with that woman. Leave me with nothing to show for 8 years of marriage except a handful of memories and a broken heart." "But Elizabeth Garrett never left her husband," Garrett said quietly. "She died in my arms, in our bed, whispering my name. Whatever you think you saw between her and Thomas, it wasn't what you believed." Martha stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You're lying." Elizabeth told me about Thomas before she died. She said he'd been visiting her during her illness, bringing her books and flowers and keeping her company when I had to be away on ranch business. She was grateful for his friendship, Samuel. Nothing more. The color drained from Martha's face as the implications of Garrett's words sank in. No. That's not true. I saw them together. I saw them kissing. You saw a man comforting a dying woman, Garrett said sadly. Elizabeth kissed him on the cheek when he brought her those wildflowers she loved so much. It was gratitude, Martha. Nothing more. Jake could see Martha's world collapsing around her as she realized the truth. She had murdered her husband based on a misunderstanding, had spent 3 years planning revenge against a man who had never wronged her, had destroyed multiple lives because she couldn't accept that her marriage had problems that had nothing to do with other people. You're lying, Martha whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. Ask anyone in town, Garrett said gently. Ask Doc Peterson, who treated Elizabeth during her illness. Ask Mrs. Hawkins, who helped nurse her. Ask anyone who saw Thomas's visits. He never stayed more than an hour, never came when I wasn't there, never behaved as anything other than a concerned neighbor. Martha's gun hand was shaking now, the pistol wavering between Jake and Garrett. It doesn't matter, she said desperately. Thomas was still going to sell the ranch. He was still going to leave me with nothing. Because the ranch was failing, Jake said quietly. Because you were working him to death trying to make something profitable out of land that couldn't support the operation you wanted. Thomas wasn't leaving you, Martha. He was trying to save you both from bankruptcy. Martha Henderson crumpled like a building whose foundation had been torn away. The gun slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a dull thud. She sank to her knees in the dust, her face buried in her hands. What have I done? She whispered. Oh God, what have I done? Jake moved quickly to pick up Martha's pistol while Garrett secured his own weapon. The immediate danger was over, but the aftermath would be complicated. We need to get her to town, Jake said. She needs to confess to the sheriff before she changes her mind or decides to run. Garrett nodded, then looked down at Martha with an expression of profound sadness. Elizabeth always said that grief could twist a person's heart if they weren't careful. She made me promise not to let it happen to me after she was gone. Good advice, Jake said. As they helped Martha to her feet and prepared for the long ride to town, Jake reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a drifter with nothing to lose and nowhere to go. Now he was responsible for bringing a murderer to justice and perhaps saving an innocent man's life. It wasn't the kind of belonging he'd been looking for when he'd ridden into Martha Henderson's yard, but it was something. Maybe it was enough. Martha Henderson confessed to her husband's murder that afternoon, sitting in the sheriff's office with tears streaming down her face. She was sentenced to life in prison, where she died 3 years later, still whispering apologies to a husband who could no longer hear them. Samuel Garrett offered Jake a job on his ranch, which Jake accepted. He worked there for 2 years before moving on, but this time he left because he was ready for a new adventure, not because he was running from his past. And sometimes, when Jake Morrison was feeling particularly philosophical, he would think about the lonely widow who had smiled at him and then tried to destroy his life. He would remember that even the most beautiful smile can hide the darkest intentions, and that sometimes the most dangerous person you'll ever meet is someone with nothing left to lose.